Hello, world history students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 30, Section 5, World War II Ends. And kind of leading up to what is known as D Day, Operation Overlord, or the Allied invasion of France. Um, the Allied military had to try to figure out ways to maybe be a little sneaky against spies for the Third Reich. And as troops were preparing for this invasion in Great Britain, they also tried to figure out a way to kind of maybe distract the Germans into thinking that maybe we would invade in a totally different place. And so members of the military came up with this really crazy idea of preparing what is known as a ghost army. If you take a look here, there's a few men holding a tank. We actually created an army of ghost vehicles that were basically inflatables. So this tank is basically an inflatable tank. Same with the truck that you might see, the aircraft, the gun that you see kind of in the bottom corner. But down in the bottom middle part of the screen here is actually kind of what I think is kind of interesting with this deception is actually using loudspeakers to play noise that sounded like trucks that were moving, tanks that were moving, the sound of men talking, and they would play this to maybe throw off individuals who might have been spying for the Third Reich to think that the Allies were actually preparing to launch the attack from somewhere else than where they actually did. This little deception worked very well. As a matter of fact, when we get to the day, known as D-Day, the Germans they weren't quite as prepared as what they could have been for this event. So when we talk about the Allied invasion, I mentioned before with this ghost army, if you can see in the upper right-hand corner of the map, it says Great Britain. You might see the city of Dover or the Strait of Dover, and across from Dover is Calais, which is a city in France, kind of in the northern part of that country. And it's there where the Nazis assumed that the Allies would make their landfall. It's the narrowest point of the English Channel. It actually is not very far from Dunkirk, if you remember that event. So it was just assumed that that's where our troops were going to show up. And this is where that ghost army was kind of put in place to kind of deceive. Instead, the Allies chose to make a landing at Normandy. You might be familiar with like Omaha Beach and Utah Beach. Those are the two beaches that Americans actually landed on. As a matter of fact, they were probably out of all five beachheads that the Allies actually came ashore on, were probably the two most fortified by the Nazis, meaning that U.S. troops primarily took more casualties than probably the British and the Canadian soldiers did. But Normandy is got a little more exposure when you talk about uh, waves and weather and such. It was not necessarily the ideal site, but it was chosen because of the fact that uh, it would probably deceive a little bit more than maybe Dover would have. So, needless to say, that's where we're going to make our landing. And if you remember anything about the Battle of Hastings back in 1066, that's basically where William the Conqueror took his nod to go and invade Great Britain. So, anyway, the D-Day invasion, or Operation Overlord. This was the Allied invasion of continental Europe beginning on June 6, 1944. And over 150,000 troops under the leadership of General Dwight D. Eisenhower stormed the beaches of Normandy, making it the largest invasion force ever mounted in history, and it still stands to this date. You see a picture down at the bottom of the screen of a man talking to a group of soldiers. That is Dwight D. Eisenhower, and he's talking to paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division. These are some of the men who actually parachuted into parts of Normandy, uh, basically in the wee hours of June the 6th at night, making it safer for the troops that were crossing the channel to land on the beaches. Many of these men didn't make it. They died in their service to our nation. And matter of fact, when Eisenhower gave this speech to these men, he knew, and matter of fact, he kind of felt it, that this was going to be a very bad situation where a lot of these men weren't going to be surviving. If you note, the photo to the left of that is actually taken from inside of what is known as a Higgins boat. Higgins boat was a type of boat that was used to transport ground troops, not only in the European theater, we also used them in the Pacific theater of World War II. But the man who devised these was actually from Columbus, Nebraska. His name was Andrew Jackson Higgins. And kind of before the war, he actually was living down in Louisiana, was involved in the logging industry, and had used boats like this out on the bayou. And it's his design that is eventually going to be what makes a difference when we talk about these invasions that you're going to see throughout World War II. Matter of fact, Eisenhower basically said that if it hadn't been for Higgins, we probably wouldn't have won this war. So when we talk about 1945 into 1944 into 1945, the Allies themselves, granted, Normandy was a pretty big landing point, but we were actually invading from a lot of different angles. Matter of fact, about the same time we were crossing the English Channel, we were actually sending troops through parts of southern France. We had already had troops in parts of Italy. Our allies, the Soviets, were pushing from the east, moving west, and the goal was to kind of meet in the middle, and that's really what's going to happen in this period of time. We're going to put Germany in a vice, and we're going to start squeezing them to the point where they're ready to surrender. So, shortly after the Normandy landings in 1944, Germans started to use some new weapons. They started using what is known as a V1 and V2 rocket. Down below here, the V1 rocket actually looks kind of like an airplane. It has what kind of looks like a jet engine on the back, which is kind of a precursor of that. But it is basically without a pilot. It's kind of a not so smart bomb, if you want to call it that. And these were used to really strike fear into the hearts of the British. We also started seeing the use of the V2 rocket, which you see in the bottom right hand corner, which kind of looks more like a rocket. I mean, it kind of has that prototypical rocket shape. What's interesting is when the war is kind of wrapping up and those Nazis who were involved in these rocketing programs, they were told to destroy whatever weapons they had left. And instead, some of these guys didn't destroy them all. And instead, they surrendered to the Allies, primarily to the United States. And what's interesting is one of the heads of this V2 program was a guy named Wernher von Braun, who actually became one day the head of NASA. He surrendered his rockets. These rockets were sent back to the United States, along with some of the Rocketeers, some of our Nazis, and they were sent to places like New Mexico to continue work on their rocketing programs. Wernher von Braun would eventually get tied into NASA when it was born, kind of in the late 1950s, and would be with NASA until his death. So moving on. In February 1943, the Soviets pushed the Germans back for a victory at Stalingrad. Stalingrad's kind of in the southern part of the Soviet Union. And this was kind of considered to be a good turning point in the war, because at this point in time, things are going to be harder for the Germans. And from July 5th to July 12th, 1943, the Soviets defeated German forces at what is known as the Battle of Kursk. And it's at this battle that you're going to see one of the world's greatest tank battles ever take place in World War II, but for all times. By January of 1945, the Soviets are within 40 miles of Berlin. And obviously, that's going to strike some fear in the hearts of the Nazis as far as what's going on that end. In a last ditch effort to stop the Allies, Adolf Hitler ordered a massive counterattack in the West, known as the Battle of the Bulge. Battle of the Bulge took place literally in the Ardennes forest of Belgium, almost in the same place where some of the last battles of World War I were fought. And unfortunately for these soldiers, no matter what side they were on, the weather was probably the biggest enemy. Around Christmas time, 1944, temperatures had plummeted. There was a lot of talk that people who were shot in this battle didn't bleed to death because their bodies froze much faster. So, needless to say, the Germans tried. Eventually, they were outmaneuvered, and Germany is in full retreat. In February of 1945, we have what is known as the Yalta Conference. And this is where plans for the United Nations are born. This would have been, or would become, I should say, an international organization that would encourage cooperation and peace. Shortly down the road, on April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker in Berlin as the Soviets were surrounding the city. And within a week, on May 7th, 1945, the Germans surrendered. And eventually, we're going to have a date known as VE Day. Victory in Europe is going to be declared the following day on May 8th, 1945. Thus, World War II in Germany ends. So the post-war world, President Roosevelt and Winston Churchill wanted a peaceful world in which nations could choose their own governments. They would be able to work for mutual prosperity. Joseph Stalin, he joined the two leaders at what would be known as this Yalta Conference. This is where they draw out the plans for the United Nations. And they agreed to work towards peace. But they wanted to have the former Polish territories have the opportunity to have free elections. This doesn't sit so well with Stalin. He says, I'll get back to you. So in July of 1945, the Allied leaders met again at what is known as the Potsdam Conference. From the meeting in February to the meeting in July, a lot had changed. FDR died literally a few days before Adolf Hitler did. He died of a massive stroke, and he obviously was replaced with his vice president, Harry S. Truman. Winston Churchill went to Potsdam, but in the time he was there, he lost a election and he was removed as prime minister. And so just a whole lot of craziness happening in this period of time. After the war, much of Europe and Asia lay in ruins. National economies were near collapse, and millions of displaced people had to rebuild their lives. And there was a lot of concerns about the spread of communism and the Soviet influences. As a result of this, the Allies, primarily the United States, Great Britain, France, they decide to unite their three areas in Western Germany. And eventually, these three areas are going to become known as West Germany. And they are going to try to bring in aid to help the German people to kind of rebuild their lives, rebuild their factories, rebuild their economy. And as a result, West Germany becomes a very prosperous part of Europe for a long, long time. The Soviets would take over the eastern part of Germany, and it would be known as East Germany up until about 1990. And at that point in time, it gets reunified with Germany. But they say it's a really difficult time, and actually something that we will probably talk more about when you guys get into your junior year of history. From 1945 to 1946, we have a series of trials known as the Nuremberg Trials at the city of Nuremberg. It's the first military tribunal or first military war crimes trial. And it's at that trial that over 200 Nazi leaders are either tried and condemned for their war crimes. Some are actually sent to the gallows, some are sent to jail for the rest of their lives. Below, you see kind of a what looks like a courtroom scene. The man that is sitting in the middle row, kind of clear to the left, right next to the military man that's wearing the white helmet, that is Hermann Goering. And Goering was the number two Nazi in the Third Reich. Goering actually does not go to the gallows, even though he was sentenced to death. He actually committed suicide just within hours of his execution date. But nevertheless, there are going to be people that are going to eventually be brought to trial. I mentioned Adolf Eichmann. Not all were tried at Nuremberg. Some have been still brought to justice in the modern day and age. As far as the outcomes, obviously there were millions of people who died in this war. Compared to a lot of other countries, the United States, we fared fairly well. Civilians, we only had 6,000 civilians that died, but if you compare that to the Soviet Union at 7 million plus, or China over a million, things were very easy on the Americans, by all means. Europe was in utter destruction. The Allies occupied Germany. Nuremberg was our war crimes trial. We have the UN that is born out of this. And eventually we're going to have the setup for a Cold War between the two big superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Thank you very much.